I'm going to talk today about Pablo Picasso, an artist who lived between 1881 and 1973. That's 92 years. So his life spanned enormous changes um, in human history, politics, economics, world wars, and certainly the practice of art. And many of those changes in art he contributed significantly to, particularly in the early part of the 20th century. His life ran more or less contemporaneously with Matisse, the artist that I discussed last. They were they were more rivals than friends, although they greatly respected one another. They paid attention to what the other was doing, and they influenced one another off and on through their long careers. Whereas Matisse responded um, most directly to the art of Van Gogh and Gauguin, artists who use color exuberantly, um, whose art is strong in emotional content. Picasso can be linked more closely with artists like Cezanne, especially. Um, he was an artist interested in issues of pictorial form, um, and we're going to see, particularly in his earlier works, him taking objects apart and thinking in new ways about the representation of mass and volume and space. Um, I want to begin by showing you some of his early works, um, which established that he was an artist of prolific talent. He was a prodigy, and he certainly knew the art of the past and had absorbed the lessons he might learn from it into his own knowledge of art making. Um, Picasso was Spanish by birth, though he would live most of his adult life in France. He was the son of a drawing teacher, and so while he had prodigious talent from the very beginning from his early years when he began drawing and painting, he also had the stimulation, the instruction, the formation that a knowledgeable parent in the making of art might provide. In other words, he benefited both from nature and culture. So we're looking here on the screen at a work entitled Science and Charity, a rather large multi-figure composition, one that would conform to conventional academic um, um, ideals of painting figures in a narrative way. Um, it's also painted in the naturalist tradition that came to dominate the practice of art in the later 19th century. Science and Charity. This dates from 1897. Picasso was 16 years of age when he painted. And so what we see here is a woman who is ill in bed, and on her one side is a doctor who takes her pulse, and so he embodies what science might determine about her condition and prescribe as treatment, as a cure. And on the other side of her is a nun who offers, looks like tea or soup, and is taking care of the woman's child, and so offers charity. Um, the these uh, competing, rival, complementary entities of religion and science are both present in ministering to the sick woman, um, as they may. We notice that the figures are painted very convincingly. They interact with one another in ways that seem plausible, persuasive. The space is also convincingly represented in a somewhat painterly way, with a very beautiful bedspread in green that's set off by the complementary red colors and the ornament at its end. Well, Picasso went to Paris as a teenager, and there he saw the works of the Impressionists and Post-Impressionists. And he was taken by the nightlife in Montmartre, and his style changes in a kind of progressive way. He absorbs the lesson of various post-impressionist artists like Toulouse-Lautrec and perhaps Van Gogh, Gauguin. This work is entitled Le Moulin de la Galette, and that title may sound familiar because I discussed earlier, you'll see in your textbook Renoir's painting of the same place. Here we see a nighttime scene. So notice all the lamps that are lit, people in top hats, interacting. But you'll notice that Picasso's style here is more summary, more sketch-like, with the figures represented as really as shapes, with very little modeling of the faces or the garments. Notice the whites, for example. It seems a scene of gaiety, color, of a spectacle, and yet perhaps there's also a sense of the false gaiety, the surface gaiety that one would find in a place like this. Picasso, around 1900, entered a period where he was very depressed, particularly following the suicide of a close friend. And so for about 3 years, he painted works like this, paintings of downcast characters, impoverished characters, all in blue tones. And so this period is known as his blue period, running from about 1901 to 1904. This is a woman whose one eye appears to be inoperative. The title is La Celestine, referring to the woman by name. And you'll notice the content of the painting is very plain, no background, no setting to speak of, but rather a blue field, and really everything about the painting is represented in tones of blue. Blue with its kind of conventional implications of melancholy, of depression, of sadness. Picasso painted his own portrait here in 1901 in that same manner, and painted really a whole host of characters, downcast, impoverished, emaciated, gaunt characters in much the same way. Around 1904, Picasso's mood brightened, and what followed then were 2 years that are referred to by art historians as his rose period. And here is an example from that time, a work entitled Les Saltimbanques. Now, saltimbanques were circus characters who performed, this was painted in Paris, I believe. And so we see a reference here to Harlequin in this costume. And here, an obese man in a kind of a colorful hat. Children, you can see that his palette has brightened, has lightened considerably. Now there are pink colors and orange colors. The figures aren't particularly jovial in their movements, but grouped together in a way that does suggest human community, which we didn't see in those blue period paintings. Notice the background is very painterly, kind of flat, ambiguous space that just simply provides a kind of vague landscape in which to place the figures. Here we see on the screen the first work that is discussed of Picasso's in your textbook. And this is a portrait of the American writer and patron of art, Gertrude Stein. Gertrude Stein was an American expatriate living in Paris, and her house was known as a place where artists and writers, intellectuals met regularly and engaged in conversation. She and her brother, who lived together, were collectors, and they would sort of pit artists against one another by commissioning works from Picasso on the one hand, Matisse on the other, with the expectation that the artists would be spurred by the implied competition to do new things, to be more original, even more creative than they might have been otherwise. So this portrait, undertaken between the years 1906 and 1907, Picasso worked on over a long period of time. And it's said that Stein sat for the portrait, um, I think about 60 times. Um, Picasso was trying to find a way to present her in a new way. And after about the 60th sitting, he felt like he could no longer see her. He could have lost his way in the production of this work. During its summer, he traveled to Spain, and there he saw um, prehistoric Iberian sculptures. Iberia refers to the peninsula, which includes Spain and Portugal. And in works like this, I'm showing you an example on the right-hand side. You notice the face is kind of generically, very plainly represented with smooth, continuous surfaces and eyes and the eyebrows defined in an almost geometrically regular way. Picasso has applied the lessons that he learned in seeing these sculptures, which he found very beautiful and quite inspiring, to the face of Gertrude Stein. So her face here is greatly simplified, and notice the concise, um, very definite definition of the brow. Likewise, the almond-shaped eyes, closely resembling the Iberian sculpture. The face is absent of wrinkles or other blemishes um, that would indicate individuality. Instead, we have the smooth, continuous surfaces um, with just a bit of shading here that marks the turn of the face as a three-dimensional object in space. Likewise, the hands are very simply represented as well. And the hands and the face, with their pale ochre hues, stand out against the warm brown tones that dominate elsewhere in her dress or garment. She was a robust woman in body, and one gets a clear sense of that. She's sitting in an upholstered chair, apparently, because it's rather vaguely represented, but in warm tones it suggests a pattern here and a line that suggests the back of the chair. So I think a very strong portrait with a lot of character that by abstracting her somewhat, by drawing on this the tradition, artistic tradition seen in the Iberian masks, gives her a very interesting and appropriate character. All right, this painting then follows, and it is, well, judging by number, a poll was taken some years ago, and all of the books that covered 20th century art were examined for the works that were included in that history, and it was discovered that this is the work that was most often mentioned. And so simply in terms of quantity, the number of times mentioned, we can say this work is the most important or the most outstanding work of 20th century art. And it really does point to a whole new direction in art making. A work by Picasso entitled Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. That would translate as The Ladies of Avignon. Now, the name of the work would refer back in time to Manet's groundbreaking work, Le Déjeuner sur l'herbe, perhaps. And there are, I think, formal resonances between the two as well. That painting showing a number of figures sitting on the grass, 2 men, 2 women. And here we see 5 women. So a multi-figure composition, which began somewhat differently as a narrative painting, which was to be called the philosophical bordello. So that painting would have located the women or identified the women as prostitutes in a bordello. And at that point, Picasso had included 2 male figures who would have appeared as customers, as clients in the reception room of a bordello. One of them was a sailor. I think it's said that one of them had the face of Picasso, and also one of the figures was holding a skull, an emblem of death. Well, those narrative and symbolic references were eliminated as the painting developed, and it was finished then, as you see here, as a painting of 5 female figures, also with a table and a still life motif in the foreground. We've got a bunch of fruit gathered together. So the painting refers to a number of traditions in the history of art. That is the large multi-figure painting image as a expression of an artist's ambition, perhaps containing groundbreaking new developments in art making, and also the still life motif here in the foreground. The work is large, 8 feet by 7 feet 8 inches. But we see the figures represented in striking, startling, and for the time, shocking new ways. This figure, for example, has legs that are not posed in such a way that would adequately support her body. She would seem to tip over. Some of the figures have faces that are alien to their bodies, seem to come from a different place. And it's precisely African masks where they came from. Rather than representing the figures, for example, this figure, as a continuous surface of flesh all the same color, the figures have been broken up. They've been fragmented into shapes and planes, and we see shifts in color that indicate some of those divisions here, for example, in the back of the figure. Picasso is also playing with shape, so that, for example, if you look at the women's breasts, this woman has curvaceous breasts that seem plausible, that seem what we would expect. This one has one breast that's a curve, another that's a point. Here also a pointed kind of prismatic form, and here even more prismatic forms. So we see sort of what I would call form reversal or form inversion. A form that has one character is altered to a kind of opposite extreme or opposite counterpart. While some of the figures look to have their body parts joined in a way that is plausible, other figures, particularly over here, and this figure in the lower right, makes no sense seen from a naturalistic point of view. It looks as if we're looking at her back, and so we see the back side of the figure, but her face is turned toward us. And the only way that could be possible is if you walked around the figure and saw her from two different points of view. So it seems that Picasso has sort of broken the continuity of time and space, whereby, according to the long-standing practice of art, what is shown is represented as if seen at one time in one place. Well, here we see multiple places and multiple moments in time implied in the representation of this image. Notice that her arm, it juts out to the side and is joined to the body. So body parts are here, no hand, the lower arm and the buttocks are joined as one. So Picasso is playing or experimenting with form in a rather free and novel way. It seems also that there's no real open space between these figures. Rather, the space is entirely filled by what looks vaguely like drapery, but the drapery is fragmented into folds, prismatic folds, that are very similar to those in the bodies. Here, for example, notice the body treated with angular breaks, angular fragments, and the drapery much in the same way. So it seems like all the space has been sucked out of this image, and what we see is form against form, or object against object. In the case of the still life motif, what looks like a melon, say a slice of melon, is juxtaposed with apples and perhaps a pear and grapes, and they're seen against a tablecloth, which is treated in a similar way. And yet the surface on which they sit is tipped up vertically, so that we're more aware of the picture plane than a illusionistic space in which things recede into the distance. Now, the faces over here, as I remarked earlier, clearly come from African masks. The face over here looks like the Iberian mask that we saw earlier. but in this case, African masks. Now, there was in Paris several museums where one could go and see such things, and certainly the same in other European cities. And this is an outgrowth of the colonial occupation and exploitation of Africa and Asia, South Pacific, by European powers. They controlled these other parts of the world politically. They took raw materials from these places, and they found markets for manufactured products in those faraway places. Um, for some time, objects, religious objects, objects used in religious ritual, but also utensils had been collected and had been brought back and shown off in museums. Um, there was, um, I think, an insufficient, incomplete, inadequate understanding of the function of those objects in those cultures. They were shown off to some extent as curiosities. And so here we really see what might be labeled today negatively appropriation of aspects of foreign culture into European artistic practice. Um, Picasso had little idea of how these masks function. He simply saw them as interesting art, uh, as man-made objects which displayed a very different approach to representation than was conventional in the Western world. And so he found artistic inspiration in those masks and has incorporated them into the painting, given them to the bodies of the two figures on the right-hand side, and perhaps an Iberian mask, similarly colored, over here on the left. Now, the painting was so shocking, so novel in so many respects, that Picasso knew that it would likely be misunderstood and it would be ridiculed. So he turned it to the wall, didn't show it to anybody for a couple of years' time. Eventually, it was exhibited, and now it holds a place in the Museum of Modern Art in New York City. I want to show you this this photograph of the time period. Here we're seeing Picasso in his own studio, and behind him are African wooden sculptures. And so this makes clear that he collected such things. We know he went to museums, ethnographic museums, anthropological museums, to see, to study, to make sketches of objects of this kind. And so here we see an example of what was labeled at the time primitivism. These objects were thought to be made by a primitive people, a less developed people. It's of course a pejorative term that suggests superiority on the part of Western cultures, Western nation states, and primitivism is the label given to faraway places and the art that they made. I'll show you also, I remind you of this painting by Cézanne, one of his many paintings of Mont Saint-Victoire, which shows him experimenting with form, taking the mountain apart, fragmenting it and the foreground landscape as well, and creating a pictorial unity that that deviates quite markedly from the naturalism that had prevailed in European art before Cézanne. Cézanne is probably the artist Picasso learned the most from, particularly in this stage of his career where we see the Demoiselles d'Avignon produced and the works that were to follow. Picasso subsequently developed a style which was labeled Cubism. The label, the term, came from a critic who heard Matisse observe that this was an art of little cubes, and so this critic, Louis Bossel, christened the style Cubism, and it's the name that we still use today. Picasso was sharing a studio at this time with another artist whose name was Georges Braque, and we're looking at a painting by Braque here on the screen called The Portuguese. Let me put up at the same time Picasso's painting on the right-hand side, a portrait of Ambroise Vollard. You can see a strong similarity here between the two in the artistic language employed. What they've done is to break the figure represented, in this case, a figure holding a guitar. And here we see the head of Vollard and his body maybe down to about the waist. So this is in the tradition of waist length or half length portraiture with a presumably a blank background. And you could call the Portuguese a portrait as well, vaguely. But in both cases, the artists have broken the form up into planes and fragments. And these seem to kind of slide in front of, behind one another. Let me point out what we can recognize. This seems to be the body of the Portuguese. Or here is shoulder. We see the head up here. And there are references to a guitar down here. You can see the strings of the guitar, and here is the sound hole, and here curves, which suggest the outer shape of the guitar. This line suggesting the fingerboard of the guitar, or the neck of the guitar. But the references to actual recognizable objects are vestigial. They're thin. Both artists are really playing with form, experimenting with form. This phase of Cubism is called analytical Cubism because they seem to be taking the objects apart and representing them vaguely, ambiguously, in terms of fragments, more or less geometric shapes. Notice over here the nose, which has been disassembled by Picasso. We see a number of lines and angles that are all parts of the nose, one might assume. Eyebrows, the eyes, the mouth. The face has been fragmented, fractured into a number of planes and partial shapes. You notice that in both works, the colors used are very, very limited. The paintings are both more or less monochromatic. The artists use a narrow range of grays and browns, some value contrast, lightness and darkness. So it seems that the element of color has been reduced, limited in significance in its role in the painting in order to concentrate rather on line and shape, on form. We're looking here then at a later development, and this is a work in your textbook, which is called Still Life with Chair Caning. This dates from 1912. And in this case, we're looking both at the representation of things, particularly letters, but also with the inclusion of actual objects. So what we might be seeing here, we might label this a tray on which a drink would be served, a pipe might be placed, a newspaper, there's a reference to a newspaper here, might be laid and carried from room to room. But the border of this so-called tray, or assumed tray, is a piece of rope. And you notice that the twists in the rope suggest the molding that one might find as a border in a wooden tray with a wooden edge. Here, Picasso has printed onto oilcloth chair caning, hence the title Still Life with Chair Caning. So this is a print, this is a representation of chair caning, and it looks photographically real. And yet, where if it's real, one would expect that these dark areas would be openings that you could put your finger through, and yet right across the top of the image of chair caning are these strokes. They don't seem to represent anything, and they're marks that reveal to us that in fact this is not an actual object, but an image of one. So he's playing here with visual truth versus visual deceit. You know, what looks to be real is not real, is a representation. And ironically, the realest things, the most truthful things, are the marks made by the artist. Notice again that the coloring is limited. The image, the object, it's part object as well as image. Object in the case of the rope is appears in a range of gray and brown hues with some value contrast again between light and dark. Now, regarding the presumed paper here, there are letters on this JOU. And by the way, we saw Brock use letters as well. Let me go back and remind you. BAL, ball. They're also numbers. They seem to sit right on the surface of the image, on the picture plane. So they remind us of the flatness of the image. And Picasso does the same thing. You know, these letters seem to sit right on the surface, and yet one of them kind of wanders astray. It wanders off of the paper on which it's located and is crossed by another form. Now, why these letters? Well, they're presumably a part of the masthead on many newspapers, journal or journal. But as your textbook explains, they could also be construed as a part of a portion of the French verbs jouer and jouir. Jouer meaning to play and jouir to enjoy. So Picasso has played with visual form and perhaps with a hope that we might enjoy it. It would seem that he has certainly enjoyed jouir, to enjoy the play, the visual witticisms that appear in this work. From a little bit later, this is a bottle of Suze. It dates from 1912. You can see that in just, 10 years' time, Picasso has tried a wide variety of things in the making of art, and his style has deviated from a kind of post-impressionist style through the expressive representational style of the blue period, the rose period, Cubism, and now we're seeing a technique which would be called collage, a work made up of scraps of paper and wallpaper, which have been glued down to a support. So he's got both real things, but also the representation of things. Here, for example, in the shading that he gives to this scrap of newspaper to suggest this is a round object, perhaps half of a drinking glass. In this work, Bottle of Suze, the title comes from the label that has been taken directly off of a bottle of liqueur. And I can show you here on the right-hand side a bottle of Suze, literally, with the label on it. The label's a little bit different in this in the version you see of Picasso's work. So let's go back to that. Now, again, it appears that we're looking at, we see all this from different points of view. So the blue oval could be identified as a table or a tray. And if we see it in this way, then we're looking directly down on it. But that oval shape is fragmented, it's overlapped, it's cut into by these other shapes, one of which is the bottle. And you can see the bottle seems to be seen from the side. Certainly the label is seen from the side. So here would be the bottom of the bottle. The label appears roughly in the middle, and the bottle then tapers to a top. But up here we have curves, which would suggest this line, this straight line would suggest that we're seeing the bottle from the side. This curve, or this circle, would suggest we're looking right down into the open top of the bottle. Down below, there is what looks like a table leg. Here's the foot and the leg supporting the table. And this might be construed as the other leg, although it doesn't really match this one. Now we're seeing the table leg from the side, that is in profile, whereas we see the table itself, the table top from above, looking down on top of it. So again, multiple points of view combined in the same painting. And this would imply movement between different places to see the table in that way. So again, he's broken the unity of time and place. The wallpaper suggests the surroundings of the room. The paper, the thing that one might read while drinking a drinking soothes, drinking this alcoholic drink, perhaps as a cocktail at the end of the day. Oh, by the way, I should tell you, this stage of Cubism is known as, it's been labeled synthetic Cubism. So that rather than taking objects apart, as we saw in the portrait of Ambroise Vollard, here it seems that the objects are being put back together. They're being synthesized out of pieces of paper, of colored shapes, out of real things. Now, Picasso would apply this kind of thinking to painting. And here we're looking at another example of synthetic cubism. And this is a large image entitled Three Musicians. There are a couple of variants of this. There also is a variant of dancers. So we're seeing three musicians seated, and they're looking out toward us. And notice from that, the label synthetic would apply here because they seem to be made out of, synthesized from large shapes, large colored shapes which have been put together, have been added one to another in order to create the larger form of their bodies. Who are these musicians? Well, this would be Pierrot on the left-hand side. Two of the musicians come from a traditional form of entertainment called Commedia dell'arte. It's Italian in origin, hence the Italian name, and it's made up of stock characters that have particular costumes that identify them as, in this case, Pierrot on the left-hand side and Harlequin in the middle. And then we've got a third figure here on the right that comes from a whole nother tradition altogether. This is a Franciscan monk, and he is wearing a hooded habit. And at least in the other view, the other version of this painting, there's also a rope belt around his waist, which is typical of Franciscans that hangs down. We don't see that rope belt here. In addition, here there's a dog. The dog seems to be a kind of companion of one or more of the musicians. The head of the dog is seen back here. The feet of the dog, obviously, the body of the dog, and the tail over here. So the dog has been is made up of pieces that don't quite cohere. The floor plane, notice it ends right here. You've got walls, and then the floor begins in this corner, but over here it's way up higher. Likewise, the table that they sit at is represented in inverse perspective. Here's one leg of the table, here's another, but the table gets bigger as it moves further away, reversing the what we would expect, reversing what happens in our normal experience. Harlequin plays a wind instrument. This could be a clarinet or oboe, something like that. I'm sorry, Pierrot. Harlequin plays a guitar, and the Franciscan monk sings and holds sheet music here, which is represented in a kind of whimsical way with just a few scattered notes on stave lines. It would seem that the Franciscan monk has a beard, and that's what we see here. This would be the ruff, the ornamental collar on the costume of Harlequin. A very fun image, full of color, full of visual witticism, visual play, and represented on a large scale, which I want to show you here. Yeah, here we see it in a museum. I believe this is in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City, with the figures represented at about life size, as we can see in comparison to the viewer. Now, Picasso's art up to this time period had been non-political. And there's nothing to compare with, say, Courbet's Burial at Ornans, or Goya's 3rd May 1808, although this painting does make reference to the Goya. But what happened is this. The Spanish Civil War began, I think it's 1935, And um, in 1937, the Spanish Republican government was still operating, but in exile outside of Spain. A World's Fair was to take place in Paris, and so the Republican government in exile commissioned Picasso to create a large-scale painting, a mural painting, for its pavilion. Um, in the year 1937, I think not long after the commission began, Picasso had not responded affirmatively to the commission, but in 1937, the Basque town of Guernica, which is located in northern Spain, was the um, was the site of a saturation bombing by German planes, lending assistance to Francisco Franco in his effort to take over and maintain control over Spain. And at noon on market day, when the town would be most active with pedestrians and shoppers, this bombing took place, and 7,000 people died. So it was an event of a horrific significance. And this spurred Picasso to act, to agree to the commission, and to choose to paint a highly political work, which we see here in response to that saturation bombing. Uh, this figure here, for example, reminds us of the figure in Goya's 3rd of May, 1808, who holds his hands out to the side in horror, in despair, as he's about to be shot by the French firing squad. Picasso has very effectively used here the techniques of Cubism, fragmentation, particularly dislocation, to depict emblems that clearly refer to the bombing of the Basque town of Guernica. There is symbolism here as well. So let's just kind of go over what we see. This is a woman who has her hands in the air, screaming in horror, and she seems to be lit afire, her clothes burning. The triangles here suggest the burning as she tries to escape a building which is set afire. Notice up here are additional flame-like forms. Here's the head, just simply a dislocated head, a severed head that emerges from a doorway and holds a light, from which light streams down to illuminate the scene so that we can see it clearly, so that the wider world can see it. Another woman here escapes from the building, from the direction of the building, coming into the center of the painting, and you can see that her form is greatly distorted. An enormous knee and the feet here, the very simplified head represented in profile. There is a horse that has been gored. Here is what looks like a knife into the body of the horse. The horse is screaming. Its roundish, soft tongue has been replaced by a spiky form. The sun would refer to the time of day, noon, on market day when this event took place. But notice that its rays, which are we normally think of as warming, life-giving, have been turned into spiky forms that suggest danger. There is a soldier lying on the ground with a broken sword. Might refer to a member of the army or a policeman whose aim is to protect people and has been killed, impotent to do so. There's a woman holding a child over here. The child appears to be dead. This would seem to refer to the Christian story of the slaughter of the innocents that is associated with the infancy of Christ. And then finally, a bull on the right-hand side. You can see the body of the bull dark, the tail, and the bull's head then turns back. Picasso regarded the bull as a symbol of brutality and darkness. The bull is not injured. The bull presides in an authoritative way over the scene. Finally, the painting is executed in white and black and some grays. So it's deprived of any color, color with its seductive, engaging qualities. That's been eliminated. I think the the color, as well as the suggestion here of text, might refer to a newspaper. That means by which Picasso learned of this event, as did the wider world. So this is very much a protest statement, an emotional response to the horror of the bombing, painted on a large scale, as I want to show you in this view. The painting is now in the Reina Sofia Museum, the Queen Sofia Museum in Madrid, where it is the giant masterwork that people come especially to see. An event, a painting that refers to an event with a very significant place in Spanish history and an artist's response to that event.